Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Krysten Blackstone. Krysten is a lecturer in international and military history at the University of Salford, where she has been since 2022. She completed her undergraduate, MSc and PhD at the University of Edinburgh. She is a social and military historian of early America. Her research is concerned with enlisted soldiers and utilises soldiers' narratives of the conflict, primarily diaries, to illustrate the diversity of soldiers' lived experiences. She's currently working on her first book, The Hardest Conflict, Morale in the Continental Army. Today, Krysten will discuss the ways in which rebelling American soldiers expressed dissatisfaction while also upholding the ideals of the Revolution. This talk is part of our American Revolution season, marking the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord and the start of the American War of Independence. So there will be time for questions at the end of the discussion for both our online and in-person audience. For our online audience, you can post the questions in the Q&A chat function, and we'll put them to the speaker at the end of our talk. If you do have any technical difficulties, we usually recommend you refresh. That seems to cure all ills. Otherwise, a member of staff will be there in the chat function to help you. With that now being said, I'm now going to hand over to Krysten.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to the museum for having me. So the American Revolutionary War, fought between Britain and the pro-independence factions of its North American colonies, took place between 1775 and 1783. Although a number of forces were employed in fighting this war, the British Army, Hessian soldiers, militiamen on both sides of the conflict, Native Americans on both sides of the conflict, today I'm only going to focus on soldiers who were enlisted in the Continental Army. The Continental Army was created by colonists in June of 1775, specifically to act as a professional army to contend with the British Army. The Continental Congress at the time, correctly, thought militiamen would be unsuitable for a larger conflict and an army might be required. As an army created specifically for the Revolutionary War, with no previous institutional background, the army was both incredibly inexperienced and constantly evolving. Understanding the Continental Army as a nascent institution, constantly trying to find its feet throughout the war, underpins much of what I'm going to say today. It's also important to understand that despite the creation of the army specifically for the conflict, most colonists perceived professional military forces as potential threats to individual liberty and possible engines for tyranny. Colonists' understanding of loyalty as it related to military authority was complicated. Military life demanded subordination to officers and a highly regimented routine. The personal independence that colonists were accustomed to and in many ways were fighting for could not continue within existing military systems. Indeed, soldiers throughout the Revolutionary War demonstrated their independence and unwillingness to submit to the army fully. They fiercely defended their contractual agreements and engaged in protests when the army was not meeting their needs. In many ways, these concerns regarding the military and early soldiers' views of their military service aligned closely with broader revolutionary ideals. These protests that soldiers engaged in are the focus of my lecture today. My lecture considers mutinies within the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Mutiny charges accounted for 5.8% of all court-martials in the Continental Army, and there are multiple a year throughout the 8 years of the conflict. Fundamentally, mutiny was a defiance of the military system from within, a plea for change and recrimination for grievances. Mutinies rarely existed as singular incidences. Larger mutinies were normally foreshadowed by smaller acts of disobedience and followed by other mutinies where soldiers complained about the same issues. Mutinies were often culmination of complaints that the army failed to rectify, a final desperate attempt for soldiers to have their concerns heard. Mutiny in the Continental Army highlights the soldiers' dedication to and understanding of the bigger revolutionary ideals. The persistence of mutinies reveals a rank and file that is aware of their importance to the war and was aware of what was owed to them from their enlistment contracts. Soldiers understood they had certain rights and were due compensation as payment for what they viewed a temporary abdication of their personal favor in return for military service. Enlisted men in the Continental Army used mutiny to express their dissatisfaction and to advocate for what they believed the army owed to them consistently throughout the conflict. So today's lecture was going to look at the following. I'll start by explaining what mutiny is in the context I'm talking about. It's one of those words that I think is used a lot, and so defining it in the 18th century army world I think is important. Then I'm going to look at the patterns and character of mutiny, both specifically within the Continental Army, but I'm also going to compare how mutiny works to European armies at the same time, because it functions very differently in the Continental Army, and I think it's important to highlight those differences. And then I'm going to finish by looking at the development of mutiny, how it changes throughout the war, and give you case studies for each of the periods that I've kind of come up with as a way to view mutiny. Definitions of mutiny vary widely, even in the 18th century, and they're quite multifaceted. They span individual actions to collective actions, and even encompass smaller things like saying something bad about the monarch. If you're in the British Army, of course, if you're in the Continental Army, I think they're quite happy for you to say something bad about the king. Thomas Syme's military dictionary, which is kind of the preeminent military dictionary at the time, defined perpetrators of mutiny as any actors who began, incited, caused, or joined a mutiny. Similarly, anyone who knew about or was present for a mutiny and didn't actively participate, but also did nothing to stop it or report it, was equally as guilty as mutiny. This talk uses mutiny to refer only to group actions, rather than individual smaller acts of insubordination. Although individual mutinous actions happened and were punished accordingly, the mutiny I'm chiefly concerned with here is collective action. There was a key distinction in Continental Army policy between acting in a mutinous way and participating in or inciting a mutiny. Mutiny as an adjective is punished and treated very differently to mutiny as a verb, and mutiny as a verb is really what I'm worried about here. The most straightforward way I can explain how myself and other historians have understood mutiny is basically as mutiny as an early labor strike because of a break in contract. Fundamentally, mutinies were a radical break with military policy and law over issues such as poor living and working conditions, pay, and insufficient provisions. Eric Hobsbawm characterizes this action as a form of collective bargaining. Indeed, Joseph Martin, a soldier in the Continental Army who wrote a famous narrative of the war after the fact, frequently referred to his service as labor and his fellow soldiers as laborers deserving of their meat. Soldiers, after all, were employed by the military to provide a service, and their enlistment guaranteed them certain compensations. This was the moral economy of soldierhood. In exchange for a temporary surrender of civil liberties in favor of military service, the army was obligated to pay wages and supply soldiers' basic needs. When the terms agreed upon were not met, and they frequently were not met, soldiers rebelled. Mutiny, then, served as a reminder to the Continental Army of what its soldiers were owed. It isn't quite as simple as labor strikes, I understand, but I think it's a good analogy for the situation. A key complication to it, though, is that soldiers are in the military and subject to military rules and authority. Mutinies are simultaneously a direct challenge to authority figures and to military structures, as well as clear breaches in military laws. There are many laws that say soldiers are not allowed to mutiny. It's very clearly set out to soldiers that this is not an action they are allowed to participate in. My broader research, as Amy said very helpfully at the beginning, focuses on morale of soldiers in the Continental Army during the war, and I primarily use soldiers' diaries to assess determinants of morale. I don't attempt to measure morale in my work. I'm not sure it's actually possible, given the sources I have and the context. But there are two actions that soldiers participate in that do hint to some sort of measurement of morale, and these are mutiny and desertion. I call both of these actions expressions of dissatisfaction. Considering mutiny and desertion exposes quantifiable patterns of dissatisfaction within soldiers, and they contribute to our understanding of soldiers, and in my case, soldiers' morale more generally. Soldiers' understanding of their place within the conflict and society, their value to the army, and individual rights manifested themselves in unique patterns of mutiny and desertion. And in the Continental Army, they are unique compared to their European counterparts. Although I'll be focusing on mutiny today, the two, mutiny and desertion, have an important relationship. And in many ways, it's hard to consider one without looking at the other. To understand mutiny, you also need to know a bit about desertion. This is because in most 18th century armies, the two actions happen simultaneously, and at similar rates across various armies. Regarding mutiny, the Continental Army seriously diverges from these otherwise fairly standard rate. For my purposes, I view these two actions as part of the morale equation. So I define morale as the willingness and ability of an individual or group to endure the hardships of war. And mutiny and desertion make up the parts of willingness and ability. The final aim of these two actions is undoubtedly different, but the sentiments behind them often come from the same place. So desertion demonstrated an unwillingness to continue life in the army. Desertion removed the problems of life in the Continental Army by leaving military structures altogether or exchanging service in one military for another, though that's much more rare. Although pinpointing individual motivations for desertion is fairly impossible, it can safely be assumed that concerns of deserters also mimicked those of mutineers. Mutiny, however, was a protest that revealed soldiers' acknowledgements that they lacked the ability to endure the war without a change in their present circumstances. Mutiny demonstrated an acknowledgement that the problems within military life were hindering soldiers' ability to carry out their service, and often was used as an attempt to resolve these from within existing systems. Instead of leaving the army, mutineers sought to highlight their grievances, and in doing so, attempted to fundamentally change military life for themselves and their fellow soldiers. Both mutiny and desertion are acts of protest perpetrated by soldiers. Desertion is a much more passive action, which provided immediate relief from the situation by leaving it, whereas mutiny intended to bring officers and congressional officials to the negotiating table and push for broader change. Desertion rates fluctuate greatly throughout the 8 years of the war, but on average, 13.7% of the army deserted annually. That averages approximately 200 soldiers or one company per month from 1775 to 1783. This is basically exactly the same as desertion rates in all European armies at the time. They often are between 11 and 15% desertion rates, regardless of what army you're talking about. Desertion occurs most frequently during organizational change throughout the war. Mutinies, on the other hand, although similarly happen throughout the war, but the reasons they occur and change, and the severity of them gradually increases over the 8 years of the conflict. The earliest mutinies of the war are power struggles between soldiers and officers regarding authority. By 1779, mutinies had evolved to instead act as an expression of a particular grievance against the army: lack of pay, no supplies, no food, no clothing. In the Continental Army, with limited exceptions, desertion and mutiny occur separately and by different soldiers. And this is important because that's not always the case. Although contemporary European armies experienced comparative levels of desertion to the Continental Army, as I said, they saw significantly fewer mutinies, underscoring a key difference in the function of mutiny within the Continental Army and its European counterparts. Unlike desertion, which is common in all 18th century armies, mutiny is rare in European armies, but it happens consistently in the Continental Army. Notions of service as a contract were particularly important to Continental Army soldiers' understanding of their own citizenship and their place in revolutionary society. Due to the persistent difficulties that the Continental Congress had in supplying and paying soldiers, the Continental Army often could not uphold its head of the contract, significantly more often than the established and more organized armies of Europe. This, combined with soldiers' understanding of their position in the war, one person said they were conscious of their rights, their liberties, created an environment where mutinies flourished. When mutinies occurred in European armies, they were almost always over back pay issues and were quite large events. In the Continental Army, the soldiers who were likely to desert were not those who were mutinied, and peaks in either action happened independently. This is in contrast to trends seen in contemporary European armies at the same time. Typically in these armies, when a mutiny occurred, it occurred simultaneously with a large-scale desertion. How mutiny was punished is also a key area of difference between the Continental Army and its European counterparts, highlighting again the unique nature of the practice in the United States, or what is now the United States. The frequency of mutinies highlighted the Army's inability to, and in some cases unwillingness to, enforce harsh punishments dictated by military law regarding mutinies. European armies were not sympathetic or tolerant of mutinies. Participation in any collective action risked capital punishment, and European armies frequently followed through. Similarly, choosing not to act against a mutiny garnered the same punishment. Because of this, collective action such as mutiny was fairly rare in most 18th century armies, but the same can't be said for the Continental Army. Mutiny in the Continental Army actually represents a really important area of negotiation between the officers and the rank and file, as well as between soldiers, state authorities, and the Continental Congress. The punishment for mutiny in the Continental Army, if any was given, is much more flexible than punishment for other crimes due to a mutual understanding of the importance of the individual soldier as well as the validity of their grievance. Even if officers disagreed with enlisted soldiers' methods of protest, few disagreed that the protest was merited. Due to a constant manpower shortages of the Continental Army, officers needed to dole out punishments fairly carefully. Soldiers needed to both be punished, but also see the justice in the punishment, enough to entice them back into service in the army, or at least to keep them in the army. As such, flexibility and uncharacteristic expressions of forgiveness were common in mutiny court-martials in a way that they really weren't for any other crime. Punishment for mutiny in the Continental Army rarely resulted in death sentences and occurred with relative frequency during the Revolutionary War. I think there's two key reasons that explain this difference. The first is that there's acknowledgement on behalf of the Continental Army that the grievances of those participating in the mutinies were legitimate. Officers might not have agreed with mutiny as a course of action, but they couldn't deny the lack of supplies, sustenance, and pay that the soldiers endured. If military service was a contractual agreement, then the Continental Army rarely upheld their end of the bargain. Baron Ludwig von Closen wrote in his assessment of the situation following the Pennsylvania Line mutiny, which we'll talk about in a bit, the lack of pay, the bad food, the dearth of clothing, together with the fact that Congress did not permit them to leave military service, even when their terms expired 1 or 2 years ago, are the reason for their being driven to this extremity. In Europe, they would do the same for less. Mutiny may have been an extreme reaction, but it was one that was warranted under the extreme circumstances. Second, it was impractical to punish large groups of soldiers. The Continental Army always lacked manpower, and enough men mutinied in multiple incidences that it would have been a severe blow to the army if they punished or executed all involved. In addition, the nature of enlisted men's service in the Continental Army was different to most European armies. The men were almost all volunteers, not professional soldiers. They viewed themselves as citizens fighting for a cause, and they were taught repeatedly by officers throughout the conflict to consider themselves as such. Sentencing large groups of soldiers to death who brought forth legitimate grievances doesn't really inspire confidence in the cause or in any sort of justice system. As a result of the light punishment mutineers received, mutiny ended up being a relatively safe form of protest for individual soldiers, while still ensuring a degree of success for the bigger collective. Although ringleaders of mutinies were at a greater risk of punishment, it was really rare that all participants suffered. It may seem odd that I'm starting a lecture on mutiny by discussing how it was punished, but the lack of robust punishment in the Continental Army undoubtedly directly contributed to the continuing practice of mutiny in this army, and is one of the reasons why it doesn't really happen in Europe in the same way. All of this goes to say that the function and character of mutiny in the Continental Army really needs to be analyzed as separate to the action in other contemporary armies. Both the mutineers and the armies that presided over the situations managed the situations vastly differently. The reasons for this, I think, come back to the revolutionary nature of the war. The soldiers are not professionals, the army is beholden to civilian institutions, and is constantly attempting to prove that it is different to the British Army. Ironically, its power and authority as an army is undercut by the broader causes that necessitated the creation of the army itself. Before we look at the specific mutinies that occurred during the Revolutionary War, I do want to break down the certain patterns that exist throughout the war. All of these patterns exist in every mutiny, regardless of the year that it happens. Some of them are also true of European armies, though not all of them. So the first is fairly straightforward. Mutiny is an action carried out by a group of soldiers. Without this group of soldiers, the acts against the army would be stopped quickly and punished harshly. It is coherence that safeguards the soldiers' protest. 2, mutiny is always motivated by a grievance against the army in one way or another. As the war developed, the nature of these grievances shifted, they grew and amalgamated, but there is always a grievance present. Similarly, the timing of mutinies tended to follow quite specific patterns. On the whole, mutinies most frequently occurred around the new year. This was typically when enlistment terms were up and when they faced additional hardships because of the elements. They had also been cooped up in winter camps for months at this point. The increased time in camp, less consistent but more monotonous duties, and clear lack of supplies undoubtedly contributed to the organization and the frequency of these mutinies. Additionally, when soldiers are encamped for months, there's no clear enemy to fight. With the absence of a clear other in the Crown forces, the other became Congress and their officers. New Year mutinies became so commonplace within the Continental Army that General Anthony Wayne remarked of the month that he, quote, sincerely wished the Ides of January were come and past. In each mutiny, there was also an emphasis attached to the persona of the soldier. Soldiers accentuated their suffering for the cause, their strongest rhetorical device and really the only bargaining chip that they have available to them. These men understood that they needed officers to view them as incredibly loyal but demoralized soldiers with no other choice. Mutiny was their last course of action. Soldiers needed the army to understand that they were forced to mutiny in order to rectify their situation, laying the blame for the mutiny with the army rather than the soldiers partaking. If a pattern of suffering for the cause could be proven, then perhaps their concerns would be listened to, or at the bare minimum, their punishments lessened. This idea all comes back to how soldiers understand their military service. Soldiers understood their service as a contract that they volunteered to sign. The notion of this contract was crucial in soldiers' conceptions of their role in society as citizens, and therefore as what rights they were entitled to. Both parties, in this case, the soldier and the army he fought for, were responsible for upholding their side of the bargain. For soldiers, their contracted terms were simple. They would serve in the army for a specified period of time, and in return, they would receive pay, food, and clothing. When the terms of the contract were not met, problems arose. The army was expected to provide just as soldiers were expected to serve. Failure in this happening resulted in soldiers attempting to leverage the only thing that they had available to them, their service. Problematically, however, in the Continental Army, soldiers who participated in mutinies wanted to serve in the army. Indeed, mutiny was not a way for soldiers to reject their military identity. Many soldiers who mutinied did so with an added emphasis of their soldierhood. They put on their nicest clothes, they march in their cleanest formations. The existence and success of mutinies also relied on a sense of shared group identity, making it much more likely that experienced soldiers participated in mutiny rather than newer recruits. The longer a soldier served in the Continental Army, the more hardened they became to the sufferings of military life, and the more attached they were to their cause, their service, and their fellow servicemen. Mutiny was the reserve of the experienced soldier. Soldiers with limited service experience deserted rather than protest in the face of grievance. For instance, Army returns in the winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge put 1/3 of all men on the sick rolls at all times. 3 years later, in Morristown, between 1780 and 1781, no more than 11% of the men were recorded on the sick rolls. This would suggest that the men encamped at Morristown were much more experienced soldiers than their Valley Forge counterparts. Their experience in the army earned them immunity from the diseases that frequented camps. Now, hopefully, you have a grasp on the basics. We can look at some specific instances of mutiny and how it escalates throughout the years of the war. And this is kind of the easiest way I've broken it down. So mutinies occur within the Continental Army as early as 1775. The army is formed in June and the first mutiny is in September. There's very little time between the two. Although there are not really major significant mutinies between 1777 and 1778, which I'll talk about later, there are at least 4 major mutinies in 1779. From 1779 onwards, mutinies occurred annually and with increasing severity. The Continental Army lines revolted in 1780, which eventually leads to the famed Pennsylvania Line Mutiny of 1781, the largest mutiny of the Revolution. Each period of mutiny has its own distinct characteristics. As such, I've divided it into 3 stages. Early in the war, 1775 to 1776, the middle of the war, 1777 to 1779, and the end of the war, 1780 to 1781. I understand that the war ends in 1783, not 1781, but for the purposes of this talk, it's easiest to just stop with the biggest mutiny that happens. Mutinies that happen early in the war are primarily power struggles between the militiamen turned army and the Continental Army leadership. Those in the middle focused more on specific grievances. But that's not to say that both issues were not at play throughout the entire war, or these two issues, the grievances and the power struggles, functioned independently of one another. Mutiny is inherently a power struggle, a revolt against the status quo to effect major change. In the early years, mutiny highlighted the limits and gaps in military authority, where in later years it highlighted the limits of military structures to provide for its soldiers. Concerns raised during earlier mutinies never fully evaporated, and each grouping of mutinies built on previous concerns. The events at the end of the war in 1781, unlike previous mutinies, were really a culmination of grievances, not just an outbreak of them. Studying mutinies by year rather than individual instances of mutiny does remove some of the characteristics unique to each circumstance. But importantly, I think it highlights the growth and the nuanced mutinies gained throughout the 8 years of the war. The mutinies in 1781 were really the culmination of a consistent pattern of rebellion. Just as the Continental Army developed alongside the progression of the war, so too did soldiers' grievances and also how they approached them. So mutinies in 1775 and 1776 were power struggles rather than expressions of grievances. Although the same grievances existed in those years of the war as would come to a head later on, the soldiers' complaints were not the cause of early mutinies. Instead, these power struggles were undoubtedly manifestations of the confusion wrought from the shift between militia to a standing army and all that applied in June of 1775. Basically what happens is after the Continental Army is formed, the militiamen that had already gathered in Cambridge to fight at Lexington and Concord and would later fight at Bunker Hill are just told, you're in the army, sign these contracts. At the end of the year, you can leave if you don't want to stay in the army. But until December, if you sign this, you are officially in the army. And that's the transition, which is to say there isn't really much of a transition at all. Early mutinies were of a similar ilk to those of colonial soldiers during the French and Indian War. 2 mass desertions occurred very early on in 1775, one in October during the Quebec campaign and another from the Connecticut line in December. Occurrences such as this happened exclusively in 1775, not afterwards. They also relied on the manipulation of a nascent institution's regulations. Misunderstanding of power between enlisted soldiers and officers and how the army would function as an institution resulted in command problems and a number of mutinies. One of the first mutinies of the war, in September 1775, demonstrated this gray area quite well. Lieutenant David Ziegler of William Thompson's Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion punished a soldier for neglecting his duty, he basically just left his post, and confined him in a jail. John Lehman, a member of the sergeant's company, was furious about the arrest and led a group of soldiers determined to set the sergeant free. Ziegler successfully captured Lehman and placed him in jail too. Shortly after, while enjoying his dinner, Ziegler and the other officers heard a ruckus outside, only to discover that other mutineers had broken out Lehman and the originally incarcerated soldier. Undoubtedly frustrated by the persistence of the soldiers, Ziegler and Thompson recaptured Lehman and confined him in Cambridge, this time a mile away from the encampment. This was successful for about 30 minutes. Members of other companies joined the mutineers and marched to Cambridge exclusively to free Lehman. With no other option, Ziegler alerted George Washington, who ordered some 500 soldiers to go and guard the jail. The mutineers, realizing their situation was unwinnable, turned back and were eventually captured. In the aftermath of the mutiny, though, Washington was at a loss about what to do. The men were guilty of mutiny, and the court-martial for the men decided that incredibly quickly. But the threat of another mutiny still loomed. What happened was the soldiers were sentenced to pay 20 shillings, and the leader of the mutinies were imprisoned for 6 days. Overall, an incredibly light sentence given the severity of the crime. Although the authority structures of the Continental Army were clear, this rebellion demonstrates the early limits of that authority. The nascent officer corps could not truly exercise the full extent of their authority without severe consequences or the threat of another mutiny. A similar and perhaps more famous example of mutiny happened in 1775 later that year at Fort Ticonderoga. Benedict Arnold, a brigadier general in the Continental Army, attempted to forbid Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys, which is a militia group from Vermont, from plundering after they had captured the fort. When Arnold was met with threats, he informed Allen that he was going to be taking command of Arnold's men, which resulted in all of Arnold's men collectively refusing to obey Arnold and threatening to go home. To appease the men, Arnold allowed Allen to remain their direct commander, and they were allowed to continue plundering the houses in the surrounding area. So the Continental Army gave up absolutely all ground they had there. This incident began a dangerous precedent within the Continental Army. The coherence of Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys and their refusal to obey Arnold created a situation where they remained essentially unchallenged. Their collective insubordination resulted in exactly what they had intended it to. They faced no incrimination, and their demands were met. Although at this early stage of the conflict, it's not surprising that Ethan Allen's men refused to recognize Arnold and by extension the Continental Army's authority over them, it does represent a foundational moment in group insubordination and protest. As the war developed, soldiers came to understand that cohesion was the key to their success. If they could create a group willing to challenge the issue at hand, it was very likely they would succeed. Both of these mutinies highlight important element in group cohesion, and a force that officers in the Continental Army spent much of the war simultaneously fighting against and encouraging: regionality. The strength of Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys lies at least partly in their title. They were the Green Mountain Boys. As a unit, they were conceived in Vermont, and they had an identity predicated on being a united force from the same area. Their coherence stemmed from their shared identity and regional connections, all of which predated the war. The same can be said of the revolt in September of 1775. The Pennsylvania Rifle Battalion was known for their musketry skills as well as their insubordination. As a unit, they understood they possessed a skill that the Army needed, and as a result, they demanded special treatment. Unlike less specialized battalions, the unit was exempt from fatigue duties and often asserted their own rules rather than obeying the Army. When a member of the battalion was threatened, the battalion sided with him rather than accepting the military structures. The Green Mountain Boys and the Pennsylvania Rifle Battalions prioritized their own units over the entire Army. The Continental Army officers understood that they were essentially powerless when confronted with such regional loyalty. The soldiers needed to be punished, but also to be kept on side, and the army was unable to stretch their military authority particularly far. Although both units were considered highly skilled, what made these units able to rebel in the way they did was not necessarily their skill, but their coherence. Inherently, these mutinies say less about morale than later mutinies did. And actually, these mutinies say less about mutinies than later mutinies do. Maintaining morale in the army was, to some degree, about mitigating expectations. These early mutinies represent the confusion that's inherent in the creation of the army and the defining of powers within it, as well as that shift from militia to regulars. As an institution, the Continental Army lacked robust structures of authority to quell mutiny with the ease that they do in later years. The officers also lacked the reputation and rapport with the men to appear on a more emotional level, and regionalism still manifested itself in home regiments rather than larger units. The mutinies of 1775 and 1776 were not units threatening to leave the service in the army. In fact, mutinies rarely had anything to do with whether or not soldiers' service would continue. Instead, the mutinies reflected the process of defining what that soldier would look like and who it would be under. These soldiers attempted to leverage their service and the larger need for it in an attempt to define exactly what their service was going to look like. By 1779, soldiers were unable to do the same. The structures of the Continental Army had developed enough that expectations of soldiers and structures within the army, although nascent, were at least defined from the outset. Mutinies in 1777 and onwards were of a markedly different nature to those in 1775. Although power dynamics were still being challenged, mutineers did so with specific grievances in mind. These grievances built up and occurred with increasing frequency and severity from 1775 to 1779. Mutiny happened less in 1777 and 1778 than it does in other years, but it does still happen. The reason this is the case is because the Continental Army majorly restructured in 1777, which allowed it to better supply soldiers and deal with grievances of mutinies before they escalated to the point of mutiny. Similarly, 1777 was the start of new enlistment terms for soldiers. As soldiers more frequently deserted within their first 9 months of service, and mutinies relied on soldiers being loyal to one another, years of high enlistment rates tended to see lower numbers of mutinies than others. The mutinies that do occur in 1777 and 1778 were not often the result of authority disputes as the previous 2 years, but rather a consequence of supply, lack of provisions, and pay issues. Within days of arriving at Valley Forge, soldiers in the army mutinied over improper supply and rations. Famously, the winter at Valley Forge was a trying experience for the army encamped there, but the immediacy with which soldiers experienced hardship upon arrival is often misunderstood. The mutiny, although relatively small, occurred on the 21st of December, but was quickly put down by spirited officers. The next day, which is just 5 days after Washington marched troops into Valley Forge, he wrote Congress in desperate need of supplies, and he observed soldiers unable to even stand in their weakened state. General James Varnum pointed out to Washington that many of his men had not had bread in 3 days, nor meat in 2. The desperation at Valley Forge only increased in severity. With every passing month, officers grew more concerned that the situation would destroy the army. Nathaniel Greene described the situation as perpetually, quote, being on the eve of starving and the army of mutinying in January of 1778. By February, Greene's prediction came true. After months in camps with few provisions and even less to do, the 12th Massachusetts Regiment approached General John Patterson and threatened to quit if their grievances were not met. The general agreed to allow the men to leave camp in search of food, and the soldiers in turn agreed to end their protest. These 2 instances at Valley Forge were so small compared to the mutiny that the officers predicted that Washington basically completely discounted them in a letter to George Clinton on the 16th of February, 1778. He praised the soldiers in the letter for their fortitude. Naked and starving as they are, we cannot enough admire the incomparable patience and fidelity of the soldiery, that they have not been, ere this, excited by their sufferings to a general mutiny and dispersion. They had been. There was 2 mutinies, just not as big as Washington was expecting. Washington understood the supply situation at Valley Forge to be so severe that he expected the whole camp to rebel, rather than just smaller groups of soldiers. The instances of that winter in Valley Forge were the first of many mutinies that arose to address grievances in the following years. The Connecticut line mutinied in 1779 in an attempt to, quote, raise some provisions, if not, at least to raise a little dust. Similarly, the North Carolina line demanded their pay and would not march until they had justice done to them. In each of these instances, the mutinies were stopped with relative ease. A similar event happened in James Varnum's brigade in March of 1779. Describing the incident to General Washington, John Sullivan wrote, quote, 90 men of the brigade belonging to different regiments collected with a view of relating their grievances to the officers, imagining, I suppose, that their numbers would give them a consequence. But though mistaken in their mode of address, they had not the appearance of violence, and they were without force readily dispersed. Although there are examples to the contrary, most mutinies in the Continental Army played out similarly. A large group of soldiers with a list of complaints brought them to officers and then disbanded quickly after their grievances had been aired. A letter from Major General Horatio Gates to William Heath, dated the 30th of April, 1779, highlighted this plea for more supplies. Gates asked Heath to send, quote, at least 300 barrels of flour to pacify the troops, immediately and more as soon as possible. The reason for this was that 2 mutinies within the space of a week had occurred, and he was concerned that more would break out. His concern, however, was that he would not be able to bring himself to put the mutiny down. Gates wrote, quote, the real cause of the mutinies is such that I dare not, no, with equity I could not, exert the coercive part of my authority. Here it's clear that although Gates disagreed with how the soldiers expressed their discontent, he found their grievances justified. Critically, these instances of mutinies between 1775 and 1780 were for the most part nonviolent. The large group of unhappy armed soldiers marching in unison undoubtedly and purposely created a threatening image, but there were rarely shots fired in the process, let alone any casualties. By 1781, this would no longer be the case. As the war developed, so too did the organization and the numbers behind the mutinies. Those that occurred in 1780 were larger than ever before. It's not entirely surprising that 1780 marked a shift in the Continental Army. Currency depreciation was at its worst throughout 1780. The vast majority of the soldiers' enlistments expired in the first few months of the year, and they were told they had to stay on whether they liked it or not. And the winter of 1779 to 1780 was the worst that North America had seen in half a century. The winter encampment at Morristown, New Jersey marked the hardest winter encampment of the war, even more so than the famous Valley Forge. The bad weather also meant that roads became impassable and supply lines lagged in delivering the pittance of supplies sent to the starving Continental Army. All of this, unsurprisingly, resulted in 3 mutinies within the first few months of 1780. On January 1st, the Massachusetts line at West Point mutinied over their enlistment terms. They wanted their 3-year term to end immediately at the new year instead of being extended like they were told it was going to be. The Connecticut line mutinied at Morristown on the 25th of May over the Army's inability to feed or pay its soldiers. And finally, the New York line mutinied at Fort Schuyler in June over pay and lack of supplies as well. These 3 mutinies have one essential thing in common. They were all stopped relatively quickly. The Connecticut line is perhaps the best example of the flaws with using mutiny as a protest. Reports of the mutiny all noted that the officers were able to calm it down by reminding the soldiers what they were contending for. Joseph Plum Martin's account of the mutiny following the war described the officers immediately after seeing it as endeavoring to, quote, soothe the Yankee temper that they had excited, and noted that the soldiers only backed down after, quote, an abundance of fair promises. Of course, this is the inherent weakness in most of the mutinies after 1777. The soldiers who participated in the mutinies did so because they wanted to remain a part of the army. Soldiers used mutiny as a tool for reform, but always failed to completely withdraw their service, as did the officers on their promises. Martin noted that the soldiers, quote, fared a little better for a few days after this memento to the officers, but it soon became an old story. We endeavored to bear it with our usual fortitude until it again became intolerable. Although a terrifying prospect to the small Continental Army, soldiers' threat to leave the army were only viable as long as soldiers carried through, and within the Continental Army, very few did. Instead, after ensuring that their complaints were heard, they continued with their duties until such a time where they needed to raise their grievances again. Mutiny in the Continental Army functioned in this perpetual cycle throughout the whole war. Indeed, officers writing to George Washington following the Connecticut Line's mutiny all emphasized the soldiers' suffering. A colonel wrote, "This brigade is now 10 days deficient in meat, notwithstanding my efforts to have them supplied. There cannot possibly be a case where mutiny can be admitted, but that this brigade has worse served with provisions than any other in the army." The lack of meat rations for over a week was not the mutineers' only complaints. In his letter to Joseph Reed following the incident, Washington explained further, quote, "The troops very pointedly mentioned, besides their distress for provision, that they had not been paid for 5 months, and that the continental currency was depreciated to the point of virtually no value. Despite Colonel Meages's reminder of their service, good conduct, and the cause they were contending, Washington continued, that the soldiers responded that, quote, their sufferings were too great, that they wanted present relief and some present substantial recompense for their service. In this mutiny, as in so many others, soldiers emphasized that the army had let them down, but they would continue their military service when some of their needs were met. Their ability to endure the war's hardship, though, was nearing its end. Most of the Continental Army mutinies during the Revolutionary War highlighted similar problems. Mutinies in the army built off one another steadily for the first 6 years of the war until everything culminated in 1780. Major defection, high desertion rates, and the largest mutiny of the war. The mutinies of 1781 are the culmination of all of these factors, precipitated by Major General Benedict Arnold's defection to the British and the harsh winter the army faced, which in turn resulted in high desertion rates. 1781 was the only year high desertion rates and large-scale mutiny existed simultaneously. The mutinies in 1781 were distinct because they sustained themselves with violence and took multiple days to squash. Previous mutineers may have marched in formation and carried weapons, but they were rarely used. Officers were shot and killed within minutes of the Pennsylvania Line Mutiny in 1781. The mutinies of 1781 truly were a manifestation of all the built-up tensions, anxieties, dissatisfaction that had been growing up in the army at that point. On New Year's Day, 1781, encamped in Morristown, New Jersey, officers of the Continental Army sat in their tents enjoying a grand regimental dinner. The next day, a reorganization of the army would go into effect, and the officers would be redistributed. To ring in the new year and to say goodbye to parting friends, the officers partook in festivities throughout the night. Around 8 o'clock, they heard a rousing huzzah from the soldiers outside. Concerned, they sent Lieutenant Enos Reeve to assess the situation. Soldiers on the right met the cry of soldiers from the left. Reeves noted that he found numbers in small groups whispering and busily running up and down the line. He would soon find out why. The events of the next hour happened quickly. Someone fired a gun, followed by a second shot, and then a third. Officers rushed from the tents, abandoning their festivities, only to find soldiers running from their own tents and forming lines. 1,500 enlisted men and non-commissioned officers gathered in revolt. Commissioned officers attempt to calm the men, but to no avail. Finally, overwhelming their officers, the soldiers successfully commandeered a cannon, forcing the remaining officers to retreat. The entirety of the Pennsylvania line, save 2 of its regiments, had mutinied. General Anthony Wayne and other high-ranking Continental Army officers attempted to squash the mutiny, but had no success. Mutineers' demands were simple. They wanted to be discharged immediately, they wanted to be paid their months of back pay, and they wanted to, quote, have no aspersions cast against them for participating in the mutiny. Well organized, armed, and frustrated, the soldiers marched towards Philadelphia, intent on laying their grievances against the army to Congress. A mutiny of this magnitude raised concerns within the officer corps of the Continental Army like no other had. The seriousness of the situation was not lost on anyone. Officers' immediate concern was losing the Pennsylvania line to a large-scale desertion, or worse, to defection to the British. News of a mutiny this large would travel quickly. Washington was uncertain whether the army would be faced with a mass defection in addition to a mutiny. He wrote to General Anthony Wayne immediately after finding out about the revolt, commending him in his attempts to stop it, but warning him not to attempt to stop it with force again. Washington feared, quote, that an attempt to reduce them by force will either drive them to the enemy or dissipate them in such a manner that they will never be recovered. Although the driving such a force to the enemy would be catastrophic for the Continental Army, a mass desertion would inflict just as sharp a blow. The Continental Army, specifically under Washington in this period, from December 1780 to January 1781, had at most 9,000 soldiers. Losing 1,500 of them would have reduced their number by a sixth. A secondary concern was that this would incite other troops nearby. Writing to the President of Continental Congress, John Hancock, on the 5th of January, Washington admitted that he was unsure how extensive this mutiny would become. He said, "At present, the troops at the important posts in this vicinity remain quiet, not being acquainted with this unhappy and alarming affair. But how long they will remain so cannot be ascertained, as they labor under some of the pressing hardships that the troops who have revolted." Much of the Continental Army was camped within the mid-Atlantic colonies, and it wouldn't be long before they found out about the revolt. Washington emphasized to Hancock that these soldiers were without clothes in the winter, they had not been paid for over a year, and they rarely had adequate provisions. With the same grievances as the mutineers, Washington had little confidence that this rebellion would not spark more mutiny throughout the army. His fears were legitimate. Rebellion bred rebellion. The aftermath of the Pennsylvania Line Mutiny was almost as trying for the army as the mutiny itself. News of the mutiny and its aftermath spread throughout the ranks, and frequent minor incidences occurred throughout the states. Nothing on the same scale was arranged, but the events of the first week of January clearly unsettled the rest of the army. The Pennsylvania Line Mutiny of 1781 was the most severe of the Revolutionary War. 3 officers and a handful of mutineers were killed in the struggle. It was also the only mutiny of the war that the army itself could not stop. Joseph Reed, the president of Pennsylvania, ultimately was called in to end it. The mutiny was a culmination of everything the army and its officers had come to fear over the previous 6 years. So what does all this mean? Evaluating mutiny in the Continental Army reveals consistent patterns of development and escalation in the mutinies during the war. They also demonstrate the unique nature of mutiny in the Continental Army compared to other 18th century armies. From 1775 until the end of the war, officers understood that the army was under constant threat of mutiny. As the war progressed, so too did the character of these mutinies. In 1775, as I said, mutinies represented power struggles inherent in the transition from militia units to a professional army. These early mutinies demonstrated to soldiers that a collective protest was an effective tool for change and also safeguarded the participants from punishment. After 1775, mutinies grew in size, in frequency, and in outlook. They served as protest against the army when specific grievances, lack of pay, clothing, shelter, supplies, were not responded to. Mutinies between 1777 and 1780 provided short-term compromises between the soldiers and the army. However, grievances were often repeatedly raised after the initial promises were not kept. Eventually, these mutinies culminated in a mass desertion and the Pennsylvania Line Mutiny of 1781. The grievances raised that year were essentially a summary of those that had been raised in the preceding years. The Continental Army was unable to quell the mutiny, and the state government had to step in. The increase of the number of mutinies after 1777 is closely tied to the creation of regimental bonds between soldiers. The longer the soldiers served, the more committed they became to their units, as well as to the broader cause and revolutionary ideals. Patterns of mutiny clearly demonstrate soldiers' reliance on one another, as well as their understanding of the value of their service to the army. Mutiny and its frequency during the Revolutionary War within the Continental Army highlights the agency that soldiers had and used to express their dissatisfaction from within the system. In this vein, from my broader research, understanding mutinies as expressions of morale is useful. The practice of mutinies in later years of the war exposed some of the nuances in soldiers' morale. As an expression of morale, mutiny functions simultaneously as a manifestation of dissatisfaction and a confirmation of dedication and loyalty. These large mutinies highlighted dissatisfaction, undoubtedly, but more importantly, mutiny was essentially a soldier's insistence that although they were willing members of the army, if circumstances did not change, they would no longer be able members of the army. They reached the limits of their endurance, not because of the war itself or because of their unwillingness to fight it, but because the structures of the army were not providing for them. The absence of provisions drove soldiers to a breaking point, and mutinies acted as a final way to raise these grievances. The subjects of these grievances represent factors that are important to morale. These soldiers were not merely drill bots who marched on command. The army was a socioeconomic sphere with complex relational structures unique to the military. The persistence of mutinies within the Continental Army simultaneously highlights a failure on behalf of the Continental Army and Congress to meet their end of the enlistment contract and provide for their soldiers, but also demonstrates a clear pattern of loyalty among the enlisted men. The mere existence of these continual mutinies demonstrates that soldiers clearly understood their value to the army and their position as citizens fighting for a cause. As the war progressed, so too did soldiers' consciousness of their value in their service and, therefore, the severity of the mutinies. In mutinying, soldiers leveraged their service to obtain what they thought was owed to them. Although an act of protest, mutiny in the Continental Army demonstrates soldiers' increased utilization of the conflict's revolutionary ideals for their own benefit. The persistence of mutiny within the Continental Army reveals a rank and file that was aware of their importance to the war, aware of what was owed to them from their enlistment contracts. Thank you.